She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She simply pointed at the 8-year-old boy sitting quietly in his window seat, his small hands folded in his lap, and said, "You need to move. There are other passengers who need this row." Her voice was flat-clipped and dripping with the kind of authority that assumed it would never be questioned. The boy looked up at her with wide, confused eyes, and the woman in the aisle seat next to him went completely still. Not because she was afraid, because she recognized exactly what was happening. And she was deciding in that precise moment how she was going to handle it. If you've never seen a powerful woman choose her battlefield with absolute precision, then you need to stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and before you go anywhere, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning had started the way most good mornings start, with the smell of something warm and the sound of a child's voice asking too many questions before the sun had fully committed to rising. Elijah Richardson was 8 years old, and he had opinions about everything. About the color of his shoelaces, about which cereal had the best prize inside, about why airports had moving sidewalks, but regular sidewalks didn't, and whether that was fair to the people who had to walk on regular ones. He asked his mother that last question, somewhere between the parking garage and the security line, dragging his small rolling backpack behind him, the one with the cartoon dog on the front, that he had specifically chosen because the dog looked, in his words, like it had been somewhere. His mother, Naomi Richardson, had answered him the way she answered most of his questions, completely honestly and without talking down to him. She told him that airports needed moving sidewalks because the distances between gates were enormous and people often had heavy bags and not enough time, and that regular cities didn't always have the same problem. Elijah had nodded seriously, like he was filing this information away for later use, and then he had immediately asked why airports didn't just make the gates closer together. Naomi had laughed at that one. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind she didn't always have time for on regular mornings when she was already 3 meetings behind before she'd had her first cup of coffee. But this morning was different. This morning she had given herself permission to just be a mother, taking her son on an airplane, nothing more complicated than that. She was by any professional measure an extraordinarily complicated woman. At 41 years old, Naomi Richardson held the title of Chief Operating Officer at Skyward Airlines, which meant that in a very literal sense, the plane they were about to board was something she had a hand in running. The routes it flew, the staff who worked on it, the safety protocols observed at 30,000 feet, all of it fell in some chain of command or another under her authority. She knew the names of the vendors who supplied the peanut packets. She had sat in rooms and argued about the thread count of the headrest covers. She had once spent 4 hours on a call debating the precise wording of the apology language in the customer service training manual. She had not told Elijah any of this because he was 8, and he didn't need to know the weight of what she carried. What she had told him over the course of his short life was that work mattered, that people mattered, that how you treated strangers said more about you than how you treated people who could do something for you. She had told him that the world was not always fair, and that knowing it wasn't fair was not the same as accepting that it shouldn't be. She had also told him very recently that they were going to fly coach on this trip. He had been thrilled by this in a way that slightly broke her heart, because it told her something about how narrow his world still was, how the simple act of sitting in a different part of a plane could feel like an adventure. Most of his flights had been in business class, not because Naomi was indulgent, but because the trips had usually been work-adjacent, and the company covered it. But she had been thinking a lot lately about what it meant to move through the world with ease, about how easily that ease could become invisibility, how quickly you stopped seeing the people around you when you were always in the comfortable seat at the front. So she had booked coach. 2 seats window and middle row 22 on the 7:45 flight from New York to Chicago. A short trip. A teaching trip, she had told herself. She had not anticipated needing to teach the lesson she ended up teaching. They had boarded with the main cabin group, which meant they were not first, not last, filing in with the middle wave of passengers. Elijah had found this fascinating. He had watched the boarding pass scanner like it was performing a magic trick each time it beeped, and he had counted the rows out loud as they walked down the aisle, which had made the man in front of them smile. He had found their row, wedged his backpack into the overhead bin. With more determination than technical success, Naomi had quietly finished the job without making a production of it. And then he had dropped into the window seat and immediately pressed his face to the glass. "It's just the tarmac right now," he announced like a field reporter giving an update. "But I think we'll be able to see stuff once we get up." "I think you're right," Naomi said, settling into the middle seat, tucking her bag under the seat in front of her, already composing the small mental list of things she needed to do once they landed. Even on a morning she had reserved for herself, some part of her brain was always running the logistics. The aisle seat next to her filled with a heavy-set man in a gray sweater who smiled politely and then immediately put on headphones which she appreciated. The cabin filled up around them in the noisy, shuffling way it always did, rolling bags and "hello, excuse me," and the particular chaos of finding space for things that didn't quite fit. Elijah watched all of it with enormous interest and narrated selected portions. Everything in that moment was fine. And then Rebecca Hartley walked down the aisle, and everything stopped being fine. Naomi noticed her the way she noticed most things peripherally cataloging, without consciously meaning to. A woman in a Skyward Airlines uniform, senior flight attendant, if the pin on her lapel meant what it was supposed to mean. Mid-50s precise posture, the kind of efficiency in her walk that sometimes came from genuine competence and sometimes came from having decided a long time ago that she didn't need to smile unless she felt like it. Rebecca was not smiling. She was moving through the cabin doing the pre-departure check, glancing at seats, pausing occasionally. Standard stuff. Naomi had watched this process hundreds of times, had sat in on training sessions that explained exactly what flight attendants were looking for during boarding. She knew the choreography. She was watching it happen and thinking about nothing in particular when Rebecca stopped. She stopped at row 22. Her eyes moved from the aisle seat, the man with the headphones, to Naomi, and then to Elijah, who was still watching the tarmac with complete absorption and hadn't noticed anything. Something shifted in Rebecca's face. It was subtle enough that someone not paying attention might have missed it. Naomi caught it the way she caught everything quietly, completely, without reacting. Rebecca said, "Excuse me." Elijah turned around. "You need to move," Rebecca said. She wasn't loud. She wasn't performing. She said it the way you say something you don't expect to be questioned. "There are other passengers who need this row." Elijah blinked. His forehead scrunched in the particular way it did when he was encountering a problem that didn't make immediate sense. "But this is our seat," he said. "My ticket says 22A. "I understand that," Rebecca said in a tone that made very clear she did not find this relevant. "But I'm asking you to move. There are passengers with specific needs who require this configuration." The man in the headphones had slid one ear free. He was listening now without appearing to listen. "What passengers?" Elijah asked. He wasn't being defiant. He was genuinely asking. He was 8 years old, and he had been raised to ask questions when something didn't make sense, and this didn't make sense. "We have tickets. We picked these seats." "I don't have time to explain airline policy to a child," Rebecca said, and her voice dropped just slightly on the last word, not enough to be undeniable enough to be felt. "I'm asking you to move to the seats in row 31. They're comparable." Elijah looked at his mother. Naomi was already looking at Rebecca. She had not moved. She had not changed her expression. She was sitting in her seat with her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at this woman with the same calm, total attention she brought to board meetings when someone said something that required a very specific kind of response. "I'm sorry," Naomi said. Her voice was pleasant and completely empty of anything resembling apology. "What policy are you referring to exactly?" Rebecca turned her attention fully to Naomi for the first time. "Ma'am, this is a standard seating adjustment. We occasionally need to move passengers based on what?" Naomi said. The question sat in the air between them. "Based on operational needs," Rebecca said. She had recovered. She was back in her professional register, clipped and confident. "I can assure you that the seats in row 31 are fully equivalent." "My son chose this seat," Naomi said. "He's been excited about this window seat specifically. We purchased this seat. We are seated in it. Can you show me the policy that allows a flight attendant to reassign a purchased seat without cause?" Something moved behind Rebecca's eyes. a flash of something, not uncertainty exactly, but the beginning of it. "This isn't a debate, ma'am." "I'm not debating," Naomi said. "I'm asking a question. It's a simple one. What policy?" Elijah was watching his mother with the particular stillness that children have when they understand that a grown-up situation is happening around them, and their job is to be very quiet and very attentive. He had heard his mother use that voice before, not often. Enough times to know what it meant. The man in the gray sweater had both headphones off now. 3 rows back, a woman with a toddler in her lap had gone very still. The cabin, which had been moving and shuffling and generally in the business of being a loading airplane, had taken on a different quality, the kind of quiet that happens when people register without being told directly that something real is occurring. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate," Rebecca said. "If you refuse to comply, I'm authorized to—" "To what?" Naomi said, still pleasant, still completely level. "To remove a ticketed passenger from a seat she legally occupies." "On what grounds?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. "I'm going to ask you one more time to move your son to row 31. And I'm going to ask you one more time," Naomi said, "to show me the policy." The 2 women looked at each other. Elijah, sitting between the window and this entire collision of wills, said very quietly, "Mom." Naomi glanced at him. "You're okay," she said, soft, just for him. "You are completely okay." He nodded once. He believed her. He always believed her. Rebecca straightened her spine and said, "I'm going to speak with the purser." "That's an excellent idea," Naomi said. "Please tell the purser that the COO of Skyward Airlines is in row 22 and would like to speak with them as well." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Rebecca did not move for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds is a very short amount of time in ordinary life. In the aisle of a commercial aircraft with 40 people pretending not to listen, 3 seconds is an eternity. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said. Naomi reached into the inner pocket of her blazer. She did it slowly, without drama, the way you do something when you are not trying to perform anything. She produced a thin leather card holder, opened it, and held it out. Rebecca looked at it. Her face did something complicated. The card was a Skyward Airlines executive identification card. The name on it was Naomi Richardson. The title beneath the name was Chief Operating Officer. The color, Naomi noticed, left Rebecca Hartley's face starting from the forehead and working its way down. "I didn't," Rebecca started. "You didn't know," Naomi said. "I understand that, but I'd like you to consider whether your behavior would have been different if you had known. And I'd like you to consider very carefully what that means about the behavior itself." Rebecca's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Elijah was watching this with enormous eyes. He had followed most of it, though not all of it, and the parts he'd followed had rearranged something in his understanding of his mother. He had known in the abstract way that children know things about their parents, that she was important at work. He had heard her on phone calls. He had seen the way adults behaved around her at company events. But he had never until this exact moment seen her be important in the wild, in a place where no one knew to treat her carefully, with the armor of her ordinary life stripped away and replaced only with what she actually was. She was something, it turned out. She was a great deal of something. "My son's name," Naomi said, and her voice had changed in a way that was hard to describe. Precisely. It had gotten quieter, which somehow made it fill more space. "Is Elijah Richardson." She let the name land. She watched it land. And then she said, "He is 8 years old. He saved up his own money to buy a comic book at the airport this morning. He has been excited about this window seat since last Tuesday when I booked these tickets. He has done nothing wrong. He has violated no policy. He has been polite and patient and cooperative in a situation that was confusing and upsetting to him, and he has done all of this because that is who I have raised him to be." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. "Now," she said, "I would like you to look at my son and explain to him why you asked him to move." Rebecca Hartley, senior flight attendant, 15 years with Skyward Airlines, looked at Elijah Richardson. Elijah looked back at her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was 8 years old, and he was waiting with genuine patience for an explanation that might help the world make sense. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I apologize," she said. It came out like something being forced through a very small opening. "I apologize for the confusion." "That's a start," Naomi said. "But I want to make sure we're clear about something. The word you're looking for is not confusion. Are we clear?" Another silence. The man with the headphones was looking directly at them now. So was the woman with the toddler. So were the 6 people in the rows immediately surrounding row 22 who had abandoned any pretense of not listening. "Yes," Rebecca said. "I understand." "Good," Naomi said. She folded her ID back into her blazer. "Now, my son and I are going to sit in our seats for the duration of this flight. And you are going to do your job, which you are clearly capable of doing, and we are not going to have any further issues. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca walked away. She walked the way people walk when they need to put distance between themselves and something they cannot process yet quickly, and without looking back. The cabin breathed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but Naomi felt it. The collective exhale of 40 people who had been holding something and were now letting it go. Elijah turned back to the window. For a moment he was quiet, watching the baggage trucks move below them on the tarmac. Then he said without turning around, "She didn't say sorry for the right thing." Naomi looked at her son. "No," she said. "She didn't." "But you knew that." "Yes." Elijah was quiet again for a little while. Then he said, "Is that what it always feels like when it happens?" The question was so precise and so completely unguarded that it caught Naomi somewhere behind her sternum. She had been waiting in some part of herself for this question for years, not dreading it, not exactly, but knowing it was coming, knowing that there would be a moment when her son stopped experiencing the world as something that was generally safe, and started understanding that the safety was constructed, that it required maintenance, that there were people who wanted to dismantle it. She turned to face him fully. She put her hand over his small one on the armrest. "Sometimes," she said, "and the thing you need to know, Elijah, is that feeling it doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were paying attention." He looked at her hand on his, then up at her face. "Were you scared?" he asked. "No," she said. "I've had a lot of practice." "Were you angry?" She considered this. She had always believed in telling him the truth, even when the truth was complicated. "Yes," she said, "but anger isn't always loud. Sometimes it just makes you very clear about what you want to say." He nodded slowly. He was processing all of this with the same focused seriousness he brought to difficult problems, the same expression he wore over homework that challenged him or games he hadn't figured out yet. He was not going to pretend it hadn't happened. He was not going to let it become smaller than it was. But he was also not going to let it become bigger than it needed to be right now in this seat on this plane sitting next to his mother. "Can we still see the wing from here?" he asked. Naomi looked out the window with him. "Yes," she said. "And if we're lucky when we get above the clouds, you'll see exactly where the engine is." "Why would that be lucky?" "Because it's how planes work," she said. "And knowing how things work is always lucky." He smiled at that. It was a small smile, a little tired around the edges, but it was real. Naomi kept her hand over his and looked at the tarmac and breathed and did not let herself think yet about what she was going to do next. That was coming. She knew it was coming. There were calls she would need to make reports. She would need to file conversations. She was going to have that were going to be uncomfortable for a number of people in an organizational chart that she sat very near the top of. But that was in a few minutes. Right now her son was watching the wing of an airplane, and they were still on the ground, and nothing had broken that couldn't be rebuilt. 2 rows behind them, a woman named Carla pressed her phone against her chest and stared at the back of Naomi Richardson's head. Carla had been recording since the moment Rebecca Hartley said, "You need to move." She had not stopped. Carla Simmons had been a middle school English teacher for 23 years, which meant she had an exceptionally fine-tuned radar for when something important was happening and whether or not anyone was going to do anything about it. She had spent 2 decades watching children navigate situations that adults had created and failed to fix, and she had developed over time a very low tolerance for injustice dressed up in professional language. She had started recording 4 minutes ago. Her phone was still warm in her palm, and the little red light was still going, and she was sitting very still the way she sat when she was thinking hard about something, which was the same way she sat when she had already decided something, but was giving herself one more moment to be sure. She was sure. 3 rows up, Naomi Richardson had her hand resting over her son's on the armrest and was looking out the window and looked to anyone who didn't know better, like a woman who had simply handled a situation and moved on. Carla knew better. She had watched that woman choose every single word, like a surgeon choosing instruments, and she had watched a flight attendant who had started the interaction with complete confidence walk away looking like she had stepped on something she couldn't see. Carla had seen a lot in her life. She had not seen that particular sequence very often. She pressed her phone screen dark and held it against her thigh, and thought about what you do with something like this. 2 rows ahead of Carla, a man named Dennis, who worked in logistics and took this exact flight every 3 weeks for work, had also been watching. He had not recorded anything. He had done something arguably more immediate. He had texted his wife a summary of events in real time, which meant that by the time the plane's wheels left the ground, his wife Sharon had already read 3 paragraphs about a COO and a flight attendant and a little boy in a window seat, and had replied with a string of messages that escalated from what to a series of punctuation that Dennis was fairly sure expressed a strong moral position. Sharon was a woman with opinions and 1,700 followers on a community Facebook group. None of this was something Naomi knew yet. What Naomi knew was that the aircraft was beginning its pushback from the gate, that Elijah had identified the exact position of the engine to his satisfaction, and that Rebecca Hartley had not returned to their section of the cabin since walking away. What she also knew, because she had spent 15 years in the operational infrastructure of this airline and understood how these things moved, was that Rebecca had absolutely gone to speak with someone, whether it was the purser or a senior crew member or simply a quiet corner where she could collect herself. Naomi didn't know, but she knew the conversation had happened. She also knew that she was going to have her own conversations before this flight landed. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude with the particular shudder and stabilization that always reminded Naomi of a held breath being released, and Elijah immediately pressed forward in his seat like the rules had changed and new information was available. He watched the cloud cover below them with the same focused attention he gave everything, and he said, "It looks like a floor," which Naomi thought was exactly right and said so. It was the purser who came first. His name was Marcus Webb, and Naomi knew his name not because they had ever met personally, but because she had a very good memory for the organizational data that moved through her office. And Marcus Webb had been with Skyward Airlines for 11 years and had a file that contained exactly 0 complaints and 2 commendations. He was a tall man with careful eyes and the kind of measured calm that good crew members developed over years of managing the controlled chaos of commercial aviation. He crouched slightly in the aisle so he wasn't standing over her, which she noted. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. "Ms. Richardson," he said, "I wanted to come and speak with you personally." "Marcus," she said, which made his eyebrows go up slightly, "I appreciate that. I've been briefed on what happened during boarding," he said. "I want to first apologize on behalf of this crew for the experience you and your son had. That interaction was not consistent with our service standards." "No," she said, "it wasn't." He held her gaze. He wasn't backing down from the directness of that which she respected. "Is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Elijah, without turning from the window, said, "Is there any ginger ale?" Marcus looked at him. Something in his face softened in a way that was completely genuine. "There is absolutely ginger ale," he said. "Would you like it with ice?" "No, thank you," Elijah said. "I think ice makes it less fizzy." "You know what, you are completely right about that," Marcus said. Elijah nodded seriously, like a man whose expertise had been validated. Naomi watched this small exchange and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not fully, but slightly. "Marcus," she said, bringing him back, "I'm going to be filing a formal report when we land. I want you to know that in advance, and I want you to know that I'll be requesting your incident report as well, because I want a complete picture of what your crew observed during boarding." "Of course," he said. "I'll have that prepared. I also want to be very clear about something, and I want you to hear this before you speak with Rebecca again." She paused. What happened in row 22 was not a misunderstanding. It was not a policy confusion. My son is 8 years old. He was in a seat he was entitled to occupy. He was asked to move without cause, without documentation, without any reasonable operational justification, and the manner in which he was addressed was dismissive in a way that I found, and that I believe a reasonable observer would find, to be something other than coincidental. Marcus was very still. "I understand," he said. "I don't want Rebecca Hartley to feel ambushed," Naomi continued. "I am not interested in a surprise consequence. I am interested in a thorough and honest process, but I do want that process." "It will happen," Marcus said. And the way he said it told her that he was not simply managing a difficult passenger. He was a professional who had also been disturbed by what had been described to him, and he was telling her as plainly as he was allowed to within his role that he was on the right side of this. "Thank you," she said. He brought Elijah his ginger ale, no ice, and a small packet of pretzels that he hadn't asked for, and Elijah thanked him with the sincerity that was his baseline, setting the genuine and uncomplicated gratitude that Naomi had worked very hard to cultivate in him, the kind that treated everyone's kindness as worth acknowledging regardless of their rank or role. Marcus smiled at this. He walked back toward the galley, and Naomi watched him go and then turned back to the window. Elijah was drinking his ginger ale in small, considered sips and watching the clouds and thinking about something she couldn't read yet. She let him think. She knew he would come back to it. He always did. What she did not know, could not have known from row 22 at 32,000 feet, with no Wi-Fi signal yet connected, was what was already happening on the ground below her. Carla had connected to the airplane's Wi-Fi 4 minutes after it switched on. She had taken 12 minutes to decide what to do. Not 12 minutes of uncertainty, 12 minutes of deliberation, which is a different thing. She had watched the video back twice with the sound low her earbuds in, and she had confirmed for herself that what she had captured was what she thought she had captured. No distortion, no missing context, no moment where the viewer could reasonably conclude anything other than what she had concluded in real time. She had posted it to a community group. She was part of a large one with tens of thousands of members, along with a caption that read simply, "This happened on my flight this morning. An 8-year-old boy was asked to give up his paid seat. His mother handled it better than I could have. Watch to the end." She had not named the airline. The uniforms were visible. She had not named the child. She had not named the COO because she didn't actually know who the woman was, only that she was extraordinary. By the time Naomi's plane was over Ohio, the video had been viewed 40,000 times. By the time they began their descent into Chicago, it was at 212,000. Sharon, who was a woman with opinions and 1,700 followers in a community Facebook group, had shared it to 5 additional platforms and had personally sent it to 3 local news contacts whose cards she'd held onto for years, in the event that something like this, which she had always suspected was waiting to happen, finally did. Rebecca Hartley did not know any of this. Rebecca Hartley was standing in the forward galley doing her job, because doing her job was the only thing available to her right now that required no decision-making, and she was not in a state for decision-making. She was in a state that she could not have named precisely, if asked, not quite shame and not quite anger and not quite fear, but something that sat at the intersection of all 3 and radiated outward from her center in a way that made her hands feel not quite attached. She had been a flight attendant for 15 years. She had managed medical emergencies and turbulence and irate passengers who had too much to drink and missed connections, and once a man who had brought a ferret on a plane inside his jacket because he believed that if it couldn't bark, it wasn't technically a pet. She had handled all of it with the efficiency and professionalism that had earned her seniority and a commendation in her file and the respect of her colleagues. She had also, she was now aware, walked down an aisle and told a small black boy to give up his seat because something in her had looked at him and calculated without consciously framing it as a calculation that he was movable. She hadn't thought the word. She hadn't had a thought at all, not really. That was the part she couldn't get around. It wasn't a decision she could point to. It was a reflex she hadn't known she had, which made it worse in a way she wasn't sure how to hold. Marcus had spoken to her already, briefly in the galley with the curtain mostly closed. He had been professional and precise, and had not raised his voice, and had communicated in the contained and careful language that airline crew used in contained and careful situations, that this was going to be significant. She had nodded. She had said she understood. She was still not sure she fully understood, but she was beginning to. The woman in row 22 was the COO. She had said so herself, shown her ID, laid it out plainly. But even as Rebecca turned that fact over in her mind, she kept catching on something. If Naomi Richardson had not been the COO, if she had been a regular passenger, an ordinary black woman in an ordinary seat with an ordinary child who did not have a name that carried organizational weight, would anything about this afternoon have been different? That question was not comfortable. Rebecca had a daughter. She had a daughter who was 11 and who played soccer on a recreational league and who had once cried the whole drive home from a tournament because a coach from the opposing team had said something in passing that her daughter had heard and that Rebecca had not heard, and her daughter had not been able to fully explain what the coach had said, but had been very clear about how it made her feel. Rebecca had held her daughter in the car and told her that some people were not kind and that not being kind was their problem and not her daughter's problem, and she had believed what she was saying at the time. She still believed it. She just wasn't entirely certain at this altitude and at this particular moment in her professional life that she had always been one of the kind people. That thought was not comfortable either. In row 22, Elijah had finished his ginger ale and set the empty cup in the seat pocket in front of him and folded his hands and said without preamble or lead-up, "Mom, do you think she knew?" Naomi looked at him. "Knew what?" "That she was doing something wrong," he said. "Like, did she know when she was doing it? Or do you think she didn't know?" This was not a simple question. It was the kind of question that philosophy students paid tuition to argue about in classrooms, and her 8-year-old had arrived at it naturally and apparently without effort, through nothing more than sitting with an experience and thinking about it seriously. She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes people do things without knowing exactly why they're doing them. And then afterward, when they have to look at it, that's when they find out." Elijah thought about this. "That's kind of scary," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Is that what unconscious bias is?" he asked. He'd heard the phrase somewhere. She suspected school or possibly one of the podcasts she listened to in the car that he was technically not supposed to be absorbing, but clearly was. "Like when people do something they didn't mean to, that's part of it," she said. "The hard part isn't always the people who know they're doing wrong and do it anyway. The hard part is sometimes the people who genuinely believe they're being fair and they aren't. How do you fix it?" "You start by being willing to look at it," she said. He nodded again, that slow processing nod that she had watched him develop over years of being a child who took things seriously. Then he said, "Do you think she'll look at it?" Naomi thought about Rebecca's face in the moment when she had read the ID card. She thought about the specific quality of the silence that had followed. She thought about the difference between someone who was afraid of consequences and someone who was actually grappling with something. She wasn't sure which one Rebecca was. She wasn't sure Rebecca knew either. "I think she might," she said, eventually. "Good," Elijah said. He didn't say it like a victory. He said it like someone who genuinely wanted a thing to be true. That was when Naomi's phone buzzed. She looked down at it. She had Wi-Fi now, which meant the message that had been queued from her assistant in New York had finally pushed through. It was a single line, followed by a link, social media developing fast. "Video from your flight this morning. Call me when you can." She stared at the link for a moment. Then she clicked it. The first thing she saw was the view counter, which had climbed past 300,000 in the time it took her browser to load the page. The second thing she saw was the video itself, shot from slightly behind and to the right of row 22, a little unsteady but remarkably clear, catching both Rebecca's posture and Elijah's expression, and most critically the precise tone of every word that had been exchanged. The third thing she saw was the comments section, which was moving fast enough that the numbers were updating before she could finish reading a single thread. She felt something move through her that was not quite surprise, and not quite dread, and not quite satisfaction, but a compound of all three pressed together into something that had no clean name. She had not asked for this. She had not made any gesture toward a camera, had not been performing for anyone, had only been trying to get her son safely through a situation that should not have happened. And yet here was the situation large and public and accelerating past the point where anyone could manage it quietly. She scrolled through the comments for a moment. Not to find validation, she didn't need it, but to take the temperature of something she was now a part of, whether she had chosen it or not. The comments were overwhelmingly one thing. A few were something else. She noted the ratio without letting it affect her breathing. Then she closed the app and put her phone screen down in her lap and looked out the window at the cloud cover below them, which was thick enough now that there was nothing visible beneath it, just the gray-white ceiling of altitude. And she thought about what happened next. There was a process for what happened next. She knew the process intimately. She had helped write portions of it. There would be a formal HR complaint filed within 48 hours. There would be interviews of crew and passengers. There would be Rebecca's account, and the witnesses' accounts, and the video which was already public and already definitive, and which she was fairly certain was going to feature prominently in whatever came afterward. There would be conversations at levels above her immediate authority, because she was the COO, and this had happened to her, which created a complexity that the organization would need to navigate carefully. There would also be press calls. She was already fairly certain of that. She pressed the call button for the first time on the flight. Marcus appeared. He looked at her and then barely perceptible at her phone screen, which was dark, and something in his expression told her that he had already seen something on his own device in the last few minutes. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to do something for me." "Of course. I need you to treat the rest of this flight as entirely normal. Whatever is happening on the ground, whatever your crew is aware of, I need this cabin to get to Chicago without any additional disruption. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, "and I need you to make sure that Rebecca finishes her duties professionally." She paused. "She's still your crew. She deserves the chance to finish her shift with dignity. Whatever happens after we land is a separate conversation." Marcus looked at her for a moment. The quality of his looking was different than it had been before. There was something in it that was trying to understand her, not just process her request. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Thank you." He moved away. Elijah, who had heard some of this and not all of it, was watching his mother again with that quiet, perceptive attention that sometimes made her feel slightly transparent. "Is something happening?" he asked. She looked at him. She had a policy which she had maintained since before he was old enough to have opinions about it, of not lying to him even when the truth was complicated. She had learned this approach from her own mother, who had believed that children who were told manageable truths grew into adults who could handle unmanageable ones. "People are talking about what happened this morning," she said. "On the internet, someone took a video." His eyes widened. "Of me?" "Of the situation," she said carefully, "and people are having reactions." He was quiet for a moment. "Good reactions or bad reactions?" "Mostly good," she said, "but it's going to be loud for a while." He turned this over. Then he said, "Is that okay?" She thought about what okay meant in this context. She thought about the fact that her son's face was possibly visible on 300,000 screens right now, that his name had been spoken clearly enough that anyone with good hearing and the right clip of footage could have caught it, that he was 8 years old, and he had just become, without volunteering for it, part of a story larger than himself. She reached over and tucked a piece of his collar flat that didn't need tucking, just to have something to do with her hands. "It's going to be a lot," she said, "but you didn't do anything wrong, and the story that's being told is true. So yes, it's okay." He nodded. He turned back to the window. The clouds had thinned slightly, and you could see the patchwork beginning below highways and geometry, and the organized sprawl of a city starting to resolve through the haze. Chicago was coming up beneath them, which meant the flight was almost over, which meant that everything that came after was about to begin. Elijah pressed his nose to the glass one more time. "Mom," he said. "Yeah, I'm glad we sat in coach." Naomi looked at her son's reflection in the window, overlaid against the landscape below them. She saw his small face and the seriousness behind his eyes, and the way he was already carrying this morning, not as a wound, not yet, but as something he was still deciding how to hold. "Me too," she said. She meant it. But she also knew that in the time it had taken them to cross from New York to the edge of Chicago, the morning had become something neither of them could put back into the quiet shape it had started in. And 2 rows behind them, a woman named Carla was watching the view counter on her phone tick past 450,000, and she was beginning to understand that she had done something that could not be undone. Whether that was the right thing, she was still working out. What she knew for certain was that the little boy in the window seat had never asked for any of this, and that the woman next to him had handled every second of it with a precision and a grace that Carla had spent 23 years in a classroom trying to teach and had never quite seen demonstrated so cleanly in real life. The wheels touched down at O'Hare at 9:47 in the morning. By the time the seatbelt sign went off, Rebecca Hartley's name was trending in 3 cities. The jetway at O'Hare was the kind of narrow, fluorescent-lit corridor that exists in a permanent state of in-between, not the plane anymore, not the airport yet, just the pressurized threshold between one world and the next. Naomi walked it with Elijah's hand in hers, and her carry-on over her shoulder, and her phone already buzzing with the specific rhythm of a situation that had grown past the point of being managed quietly. She did not look at the phone yet. She let it buzz. Elijah was talking about the landing, about how he'd felt the exact moment the wheels connected with the runway, about whether pilots could feel the difference between a smooth landing and a rough one, the way passengers could about whether there was a score for landings, the way there were scores for gymnastics. She answered him while moving, and while keeping track of the buzzing, and while doing the things she had learned to do over years of being someone who carried weight in every direction. She was fully present with her son, and simultaneously aware of everything else, which was a kind of cognitive multitasking that looked effortless from outside and was in fact completely exhausting. They came out into the terminal, and the noise of O'Hare swallowed them immediately, the announcements and the rolling bags and the particular density of a major hub airport at 10 in the morning. Naomi stopped at the first bench she saw and sat Elijah down and crouched in front of him and said, "I have to make some calls, real ones. Can you sit here and look like a person who is completely fine because you are completely fine?" He gave her the look that meant he understood she was being slightly funny about something that wasn't entirely funny. "Yes," he said. "Do you want a snack while I do that? Do you have anything?" She dug in her bag and produced a granola bar that had been in there long enough that she'd forgotten about it, which he accepted without complaint because Elijah was the kind of child who treated whatever was available as sufficient, which was one of approximately 40 things about him that made her chest ache with something she had no clean word for. She stood up and called her assistant first. Diane picked up before the second ring, which told Naomi everything she needed to know about the state of things. Diane was meticulous and calm by disposition, and she only answered on the first ring when something was moving faster than she could track. "Tell me where it is," Naomi said. 700,000 views as of 8 minutes ago, Diane said. "It's been picked up by 3 national accounts. A P is asking for comment. 2 local Chicago affiliates have already called the corporate communications line. The communications team wants a call with you at your earliest. Is Thomas on it?" Thomas Whitfield was Skyward's head of communications. He was good at his job and had the specific skill rare in his field of not making a crisis worse by talking too much. "He's been briefed," Diane said. "He's waiting on your direction. Tell him no statement until I speak with him personally. No one from our communications team makes any public comment before I do. Tell him that directly." "Done." "What's the tone?" Diane paused, and Naomi knew the pause meant she was selecting carefully. "The majority is supportive of you and Elijah. There is significant anger directed at the flight attendant. Some of the coverage is using language like racial profiling, discrimination, biased treatment. A smaller segment is trying to complicate the narrative." "What does complicate mean?" "Suggesting the flight attendant may have had a policy reason we don't know. Suggesting the video doesn't show the full story. The usual." "Is there a policy reason?" "Our legal team reviewed the incident report from the crew within the last hour. There was no operational basis for the seat change request. None documented." Naomi absorbed this. "Okay," she said. "Book me a conference room at the Hyatt near the office. I'll need 2 hours before my afternoon meetings. And Diane, I need you to do something else." "Of course." "Find out who took the video. They posted without naming me or Elijah, and I want to talk to them before this goes any further." There was a brief pause. "I'll get on it now." Naomi hung up and turned back to the bench where Elijah was eating his granola bar and watching airport foot traffic with the same interested attention he gave everything. She stood there for a moment and looked at her son and thought about what 700,000 meant. Not the number she was past the number, but what it meant for him, for the question of whether he would grow up understanding this morning as something that happened to him or something that moved through him and came out the other side as something else. She didn't know yet. She wasn't sure it was her decision to make. What she knew was that across the city of Chicago and across several cities beyond it, people were watching a video of her son's face, his confusion, his patience, his small folded hands, and they were feeling something about it. And whatever they were feeling, it was moving. She walked back to the bench and sat next to him, and he looked at her and said, "That sounded serious." "It was moderately serious," she said. "Is it about the video?" She looked at him. "You heard that." "You said 700,000, he said. "That's a lot." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are people being mean about it?" "Some people are always going to look for a way to be mean about things," she said. "Most people aren't." "What are most people saying?" She thought about how to answer this. She thought about the comments she had scrolled through on the plane, the people who had written about their own children, about their own experiences in airports and restaurants and office buildings and classrooms, about the particular exhaustion of being someone whose right to be somewhere is perpetually questioned. She thought about the woman who had written simply, "I have been that boy," and the man who had written, "This is why I'm afraid every time my son goes somewhere without me." "They're saying that what happened to you was wrong," she said, "and that you handled it well." Elijah considered this. "I didn't really do anything." "You stayed calm," she said. "You asked the right questions. You didn't let anyone make you feel like you didn't belong in your seat." "I did feel like I didn't belong," he said quietly. She went very still. "For a second," he added. "Right at the beginning, before I remembered." "Remembered what?" He looked at her. "That I did belong, because we bought the tickets." She put her arm around him and pulled him into her side without making it a production. Just contact warmth, the physical language they had between them that was older than words. He leaned into her for exactly the amount of time he needed to, and then straightened up again because he was 8 and he had a reputation to maintain in public which she respected. "Okay," he said. "What do we do now?" "We go to my meeting," she said. "And then I think we should find somewhere that has really good deep dish pizza for lunch." He looked at her with the focused analysis of someone evaluating a proposal. "Is that a real plan, or are you distracting me?" "Both," she said honestly. "It can be both." He nodded. "Okay, but I want to pick the place." She handed him her phone open to a map search for pizza near the Loop, and he immediately became deeply invested in reading ratings and reviews with the intensity of a food critic who had been sent on assignment, and she stood up and looked around the terminal and thought about Rebecca Hartley. She had not stopped thinking about Rebecca Hartley. On the ground level of O'Hare at approximately that same moment, Rebecca Hartley was sitting in the crew break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and her phone face down on the table in front of her, and a sensation in her chest that she had identified after considerable internal debate as something between dread and grief. Her union rep, a woman named Phyllis, who was efficient and unsentimental, and who had sat through more crew hearings than Rebecca could count, had arrived 9 minutes after the aircraft cleared the gate. Phyllis had the specific energy of someone who had already assessed the situation before walking in, and was now deciding how much of her assessment to share. "Tell me what happened," Phyllis had said. Rebecca had told her. She had told her the factual sequence boarding the row, the seating request, the confrontation, the ID card, the apology. She had been honest. She had not framed it strategically, which was either her best or worst instinct. In this moment, she wasn't sure which. She had simply told it the way it had happened. Phyllis had listened without interrupting. When Rebecca finished, there was a silence that was very similar in texture to the silence that had followed Naomi, showing her ID on the plane that quality of something landing and settling. "Is there a video?" Rebecca asked. Phyllis looked at her. "Yes." "How bad is it?" "It's clear," Phyllis said, which was not the same as bad, but functioned the same way in context. Rebecca looked at her cold coffee. I need to see it. You will. Right now, what I need to know is whether there's anything you want to tell me that you didn't tell me just now. Anything that happened before I arrived here. Any communication you had with anyone. I spoke with Marcus in the galley. What did he say? He said it was going to be significant. Rebecca paused. He was right. Phyllis pulled out a tablet and turned it toward her. Rebecca watched herself walk down the aisle. She watched herself stop. She watched from the outside what her face did when she looked at Elijah, and what it did when she looked at Naomi, and what it did when she heard the words Chief Operating Officer. She watched herself walk away. She set the tablet down. Phyllis, she said. Yeah. Is there any version of this where I look at that video and the problem was something other than what it looks like? Phyllis was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, which made her silences informative. What does it look like to you? She said. Rebecca looked at the cold coffee. Like I looked at that little boy and decided without thinking about it that he was in the way of something. And I wouldn't have looked at a different child and decided the same thing. The words sat there between them. Phyllis put the tablet away. Okay, she said. That's honest. I appreciate honest. It doesn't make this easier, but it's what I need from you. What happens now? HR has already been contacted. There will be a formal investigation. Given the public nature of this, and we are talking about a very public nature, Rebecca, this thing is everywhere. You should expect that it will move quickly. The COO is directly involved, which means it goes up the chain faster than a standard incident. Am I suspended? Phyllis looked at her steadily. Not yet, but you should prepare yourself. Rebecca nodded. She nodded the way you nod when you already knew the answer before you asked the question and asked it anyway because you needed to hear it out loud. I have a daughter, she said, which was not a logical thing to say in this moment, but was the thing that had been sitting behind everything else since she had watched herself on that screen. Phyllis waited. She's 11, Rebecca said. She plays soccer, and one time a coach said something to her at a tournament, and she cried the whole way home, and I told her that people who weren't kind, that was their problem, not hers. She stopped. I believe that. I still believe it. Okay, Phyllis said. I just didn't know, Rebecca said very quietly, that I might be one of those people sometimes. The break room was quiet around them. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the corridor, a cart with a squeaky wheel moved past. That's the thing about this kind of thing, Phyllis said. And she said it without gentleness and without cruelty, just plainly the way she said everything. Nobody thinks they're that person. That's the whole problem. Across town in the conference room, Diane had booked at the Hyatt. Naomi was on a call with Thomas Whitfield and 2 members of the legal team and the company's head of HR, a woman named Greta, who had the focused, unflappable quality of someone who had processed a great deal of human complexity over a long career and had not yet met a situation she couldn't organize into a sequence of manageable steps. Elijah was in an adjacent room with Diane, who had materialized with a bag containing a coloring book, a tablet loaded with approved games, and somehow a Chicago-style hot dog, which had elevated Diane to a position of esteem in Elijah's personal rankings that would likely persist for years. The video is at 1.2 million views, Thomas said. He was not reading this with alarm. He was reading it the way you read temperature data, as information that determined what came next. We have requests from 8 media outlets. I've held all of them with a standard we are looking into the matter and will provide a statement shortly. Good, Naomi said. Here's what the statement says. She had been composing it in her head since the plane. Skyward Airlines is aware of the incident that occurred on Flight 447 this morning. We take all allegations of discriminatory treatment with the utmost seriousness. We are conducting a full and thorough investigation, and we are committed to ensuring that every passenger who travels with us is treated with dignity and respect, without exception. We will have more to share as the investigation progresses. Thomas typed as she spoke. Short, he said. Controlled. That's intentional, she said. I don't want a lengthy statement right now because I don't want to appear to be managing the story. I want to appear to be addressing a problem. There's a difference. Agreed. Greta, she said. Yes. Greta's voice was precise and professional and slightly clipped in the way of someone who was already running 3 parallel processes. Walk me through the investigation timeline. Given the seniority of the personnel involved, yourself included, we've escalated to expedited protocol. Rebecca Hartley will be interviewed formally within 48 hours. The purser's incident report is already in. Passenger statements are being collected now from the crew's records of seating in adjacent rows. The video is being treated as corroborating documentation. What does the video show that our internal records corroborate that there was no operational basis for the seat change request? Greta said. No weight distribution issue, no medical accommodation on record for that row, no documented reason of any kind. Then the investigation's question is not whether the request was appropriate, Naomi said. It wasn't. The question is why it was made. Silence on the line. That's the question, Greta agreed. And that question has an answer, Naomi said. I want to make sure the process allows space for that answer to be stated clearly on the record by everyone involved, including Rebecca Hartley. There was a pause from the legal side of the call. One of the attorneys, a man named Bradford, who had been with the company's outside firm for 9 years, said carefully, Naomi, I want to flag that some of what you're describing could create complexity if this proceeds to any kind of litigation. Bradford, she said, and her voice was perfectly even. I want this done right. I don't want it done fast. I don't want it done quietly. And I don't want it done in a way that protects the institution at the expense of the truth. I have a son who today experienced something that he will carry with him for a long time, possibly forever. And I want the process that follows to be something I can explain to him honestly when he's old enough to understand all of it. Can you work within those parameters? A brief pause. Yes, Bradford said. Good, she said. She wrapped the call in 12 minutes, which was efficient, and then she sat alone in the conference room for exactly 4 minutes before she allowed herself to put her face in her hands. Not to cry. She wasn't going to cry right now. She was going to breathe for 4 minutes in the quiet room, and she was going to let the weight of the morning settle into her bones the way it needed to before she stood up and went back into the next thing. Somewhere in those 4 minutes, she thought about her mother who had raised her in a house where the word dignity was not ornamental, it was structural. It held the whole thing up. Her mother who had told her when she was about Elijah's age that there would be rooms where people looked at her and decided before she opened her mouth what she was and what she was allowed to be, and that her job was not to convince them otherwise by being smaller. Her job was to walk into those rooms and be so completely undeniably herself that the decision they'd already made became impossible to sustain. She had spent her entire career doing exactly that. Today, her son had done it too. He had done it without knowing the full architecture of what he was navigating. He had done it just by being a patient, curious, honest 8-year-old who believed that having a ticket meant you belonged in your seat. 4 minutes. She lifted her face out of her hands. She stood up. She straightened her blazer and picked up her phone and walked out of the conference room and into the adjacent room where Elijah was sitting cross-legged on the floor with Diane working on the coloring book with the focused dedication he brought to everything, and he looked up when she came in and said, Mom, Diane says the deep dish place I picked has a 2-hour wait. That's very popular pizza. She also says we can call ahead. Smart. He held up the coloring book. He had colored a picture of a city skyline, and he had colored it in colors that were not realistic: purple buildings, orange sky, green water, and it was, she thought, completely extraordinary. What do you think? He said. She looked at it for a long moment. I think it's perfect, she said. He looked at it himself with the critical eye of the artist. The water should probably be blue, he said, but I like it better this way. Then it's better this way, she said. He nodded and went back to it, and Diane caught Naomi's eye over his head and gave her a look that was small and professional and contained in its smallness a great deal of human recognition. The look of one woman watching another woman continue to hold things together in a way that was not as easy as it appeared. Naomi's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had enough calls queued already, enough people waiting for pieces of her, but something made her thumb the screen. Ms. Richardson. The voice on the other end was uncertain in the specific way of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and then forgot it when the call actually connected. My name is Carla Simmons. I was on your flight this morning. I was sitting in row 25. Naomi was very still. Ms. Simmons, she said. I'm the one who took the video, Carla said. I wasn't trying to. I did it because I thought someone needed to, but it got so much bigger than I expected, and I wanted to call you before anything else happened because it's your son's face, and I should have asked, and I'm sorry that I didn't. The apology was genuine. It had the slightly breathless quality of something that had been rehearsed but was coming out differently in real time, and Naomi recognized the difference between performed contrition and actual discomfort, and what she was hearing was the latter. She stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind her. Ms. Simmons, she said. Thank you for calling. A beat. You're not angry. I didn't say that, Naomi said. I said thank you for calling. Those aren't the same thing. She paused. Can I ask you something? Yes. When you decided to record, what made you decide to keep going, after the first few seconds when you could see it wasn't going to be brief? Carla was quiet for a moment. Because I kept thinking about who was going to believe it otherwise, she said. And I've been a teacher for 23 years, and I've had too many kids come to me and tell me something happened and not be believed because there was nothing to show anyone. And I didn't want that to be this. Naomi stood in the hallway of the Hyatt and looked at the wall in front of her and thought about that answer for a full 5 seconds, which was a long time in a conversation. Ms. Simmons, she said. I'm going to need your contact information passed to my legal team, not because you're in trouble, because you may be a part of what comes next, and I'd like you to be prepared for that. Okay, Carla said. She sounded steadier now. Okay, I can do that. And Ms. Simmons? Yes, thank you, Naomi said again, for paying attention. She hung up. She stood in the hallway for another moment and thought about all the things that were in motion right now. The investigation, the media, the video, climbing past numbers. She had stopped tracking the conversations that hadn't happened yet, that were going to reshape things at Skyward in ways that would outlast this one flight and this one morning. She thought about Rebecca Hartley, in a break room somewhere with cold coffee and a union rep and a very specific kind of reckoning. She thought about Elijah on the other side of the door, coloring impossible colors on a city skyline. She thought about what her mother would say right now if she could call her and she couldn't. Her mother had been gone for 4 years, which was a loss. She carried the way you carry something you've learned to balance rather than put down. Her mother would have said, "You planted something today. You don't get to choose what grows, but you planted it." She put her phone in her pocket. She went back through the door. The deep dish pizza was everything Elijah had promised it would be, based on the reviews he had read with the focused intensity of a professional critic, and he ate 2 full slices and declared the third one a serious possibility, while Naomi sat across from him and drank her coffee and watched him be 8 years old in the middle of everything. Which was, she had decided, the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed anyone do. He didn't know he was doing it. That was the part that got her. He was just eating pizza and talking about the crust, and whether the tomato sauce was better on top of the cheese, or under it, a debate he had apparently been having with himself for the entire meal. And he was doing all of this while the world outside the restaurant window was running a story about his face that had now crossed 2 million views and was sitting in the headlines of 4 national news organizations and had been referenced twice on cable television in the last hour, which Diane had communicated to Naomi via a rapid series of texts that she was reading under the table with the practiced invisibility of someone who had been managing 2 conversations simultaneously for most of her adult life. "Mom," Elijah said. She looked up. "You're reading your phone." "I know, I'm sorry." She put it face down on the table. "You have my full attention." He studied her with the particular forensic quality he sometimes deployed when he suspected he was being managed. "Is it still about this morning?" "Yes." "How big is it now?" She considered whether to tell him the number. She decided that a child who had already processed what he'd processed today deserved the accurate version of reality. 2 million, she said. He put his fork down. 2 million people watched a video of me, he said. A video of the situation. she said carefully. Your face is in it, yes. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him do the calculation that only an 8-year-old could do. Not the political calculation, not the strategic one, but the pure and unfiltered one. 2 million strangers have seen a moment when I felt confused and small and uncertain, and that moment is now permanent and public, and I did not choose that. Did they see when I looked at you? He asked. Probably. I didn't want to look scared, he said. I was trying not to. You didn't look scared, she said. You looked like someone who was thinking. He absorbed this. What's the difference? Fear closes the face down, she said. Thinking opens it up. You looked like someone who was open. He considered this for a moment, then picked up his fork again, which she interpreted as acceptance. Okay, he said. Can I have the third slice? You absolutely can have the third slice. He served himself, and she picked up her phone again, and the text from Diane at the top of the screen said, CNN wants a sit-down. A BC affiliate in Chicago is outside the Hyatt. Thomas says hold. Legal says hold. Your call. She typed back, hold, and set the phone down again. What she needed before any camera and any microphone and any carefully worded statement delivered to a journalist who was going to clip it into a 20-second segment, regardless of what she actually said, was to understand the full shape of what had happened inside Skyward Airlines' own walls. Because the story being told outside was a story about a flight attendant and a COO and a little boy, and a video that 2 million people had watched. But the story being told inside the one happening right now in HR offices and executive corridors and legal conference rooms, that was a different story, and it was the one that was going to determine what actually changed. She knew the difference between accountability that produced change and accountability that produced optics. She had been in this industry long enough to have seen both, and she had not survived 15 years in executive leadership by being unable to tell them apart. What she did not yet know was which one this was going to be. She was about to find out. The call came from James Whitmore at 2:14 in the afternoon. James Whitmore was the CEO of Skyward Airlines, which meant he was the one person in the company whose authority was positioned above Naomi's in the organizational chart, and he was a man she respected in the measured and conditional way that she respected most people based on what they did when things were difficult, not what they said when things were easy. She stepped out of the restaurant to take the call. Naomi. His voice was controlled in the way that told her he had been in back-to-back conversations since morning and had not yet eaten lunch. James. I've been briefed, he said, fully. I've seen the video. I've spoken with legal and with Greta and with Thomas. I want to hear it from you directly, she told him. Not the version she would give the press, not the version she would include in a formal report. The actual version, the one that started with Elijah's small hands folded in his lap and ended with a woman in a break room watching herself on a screen and recognizing something she hadn't known was there. James listened without interrupting, which she noted. He was good at that. When she finished, there was a pause that was about 3 seconds long, which from James meant he was deciding something. What do you want from this? He asked. It was a direct question. She appreciated it. I want a real investigation with a real outcome. I don't want Rebecca Hartley quietly reassigned to a different route and a notation in her file that gets reviewed in 6 months and then filed. I want this to be the thing that makes us actually look at our training infrastructure, our complaint processes, our culture of who gets the benefit of the doubt in this company and who doesn't. You're talking about something larger than one incident. One incident is never just one incident, she said. You know that. Another pause. You know there are board members who are going to want this contained. I know, she said, and I know what contained means in this context, and I'm not interested in it. Naomi. His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but closer to something that was less CEO and more human. Your son was on that plane. Yes, she said. He was. How is he? She glanced back through the restaurant window. Elijah had finished the third slice and was now drawing something on a napkin with a pen he had apparently sourced from somewhere. His head bent over it with total concentration, unbothered and present and completely himself. He's eating Chicago deep dish and drawing on napkins, she said. He's better than I am. James was quiet for a moment. "I'll back you on the process," he said. "Whatever you need. But I need you to work with Thomas on the public piece. We can't have the story run ahead of us." "Agreed," she said. "But the public statement reflects the actual process, James, not the other way around." "I know," he said. And the way he said it told her that he had already understood this and had called her not to negotiate, but to say in the way that people at their level sometimes communicated indirectly but completely that he was on her side of it. She went back inside and sat across from her son, and he held up the napkin. He had drawn a plane. It was rough and slightly lopsided the way all hand-drawn planes are, but it had windows and a tail and what appeared to be a figure looking out of one of the windows, and beneath it he had written in his careful 8-year-old printing, "This is us." She looked at it for a long time. "Can I keep this?" she asked. He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone concealing pride. "It's just a napkin." "I know," she said. "Can I keep it?" He pushed it across the table. "Yeah," he said. "You can keep it." She folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer next to her ID card, which was next to her heart, which she thought later was exactly where both of them belonged. What was happening simultaneously across the city, across the country, truthfully. But Chicago was where the weight of it was densest right now, was the specific and unstoppable physics of a story that had decided it was bigger than any one person's management of it. By 3 o'clock, Carla Simmons had given 2 phone interviews from her sister's apartment, where she had gone because she had started to understand that going home to her own apartment might involve cameras on her front steps, which she had not anticipated when she pressed record at 7:45 in the morning. She was precise in those interviews and careful about Elijah. She did not name him. She redirected every question about his identity. She said clearly and repeatedly that her concern was the incident and what it represented, not the individuals. She said that she was a teacher and that she had spent 23 years telling her students that when you see something that isn't right, you don't look away. She said she had not looked away. She said she would make the same choice again. She did not say that she had spoken with Naomi Richardson because Naomi had asked her not to hide it, but because that conversation was private, and it needed to stay that way until the right moment. Carla honored that. She was, as it turned out, a woman of her word. By 3:32, of Carla's former students had posted separately on social media about things they had brought to her attention over the years and the way she had handled them, which was not something Carla had expected, and which made her sit on her sister's couch and put her hands over her face and stay that way for approximately 4 minutes, which anyone who knew her would have recognized as a very long time. By 4 o'clock, a woman in Atlanta named Deshawn had posted a video of her own sitting in her car in a parking lot talking directly to the camera about the last time she had flown Skyward Airlines and the thing that had happened to her in the check-in line that she had not posted about at the time because she had not thought anyone would care. The video got 300,000 views in 90 minutes, and then a man in Seattle posted a similar one, and then a woman in Houston. And then the story was no longer about one flight and one row and one morning in New York. It was about something that had been building pressure for a long time, and what had happened in row 22 was the place where it finally found a crack in the surface and came through. Thomas Whitfield had been a communications professional for 22 years, and he had managed crises involving mechanical failures and weather events, and once a very unfortunate social media post by a junior employee that had taken 6 weeks and an enormous amount of creativity to address. He had never managed a crisis that had a moral dimension this clear, this public, and this personally connected to his own COO. He sat in his office at the Skyward headquarters building in New York and looked at his screens and thought about the statement Naomi had dictated to him on the call that morning, short, controlled, focused on process rather than outcome. And he thought about how a statement that was appropriate 3 hours ago might need to be different now, because 3 hours ago this was a story about one incident, and now this was a story about a pattern that people were actively in real time documenting in their own words from their own lives. He called Naomi at 4:12. "You've seen the other videos," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," he said. "Then you know what I'm thinking." "I think I do," he said. "You want to address the pattern." "I want to address the truth," she said. The truth is that what happened to my son was not an anomaly. We both know that. Our complaint data knows that. Today gave people permission to say it out loud, and they're saying it, and the question is whether Skyward Airlines meets that moment or manages it. Thomas was quiet for a beat. Naomi, if we acknowledge the pattern publicly, we open ourselves to significant liability. Thomas, she said, we are already liable. The question is whether we spend the next 18 months pretending we aren't and losing the public's trust entirely, or whether we stand up right now and say that we are taking this seriously in a way that is larger than one flight attendant and one incident report. Bradford is going to push back. Bradford works for us, she said. I like Bradford. He's good at his job. His job is to protect the company. My job is to make sure the company is worth protecting. A pause on the line. What do you want the statement to say? Thomas asked. She had been composing it in her head since she left the restaurant, through the car ride back to the hotel, and through Elijah's bath time, and through the 40 minutes she had spent sitting in the chair next to his bed while he fell asleep, because he had asked her to stay, and she had said yes, without hesitating, which was not a complicated decision. She had looked at him sleeping and thought about what it meant that the world had watched him today, and that some portion of the people who watched him had recognized themselves in his face, or their children, or their siblings, or their parents, had recognized a specific kind of confusion that comes from being told by the architecture of a space that you don't belong in it, even when you have every right to be there. She had thought about what she wanted to do with that recognition. She had thought about her mother. She told Thomas what the statement would say. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that she recognized as professional recalibration, the sound of a communications expert taking something that was larger than what he had prepared for and adjusting his entire framework around it. That's not a statement, he said finally. That's a commitment. Yes, she said. It is. The board is going to have questions. They should, she said, and I'll answer them, directly on the record as the COO of this company. She paused. James is backing this. Another silence. Okay, Thomas said, and then in a quieter register, stepping slightly out of the professional distance that was his default mode, Naomi, for what it's worth the way you handled it on that plane, everyone who's seen the video is saying it, you didn't flinch. She was quiet for a moment. I was terrified, she said. A beat. You didn't look it. No, she said. I didn't. She hung up. The statement went out at 6:47 in the evening under Naomi's name, not the generic corporate communications banner, but her name, Naomi Richardson, Chief Operating Officer, Skyward Airlines. And it said what she had dictated to Thomas, which was that Skyward Airlines was aware of this morning's incident and took full responsibility for the failure of its service standards, and that the investigation was underway and would be transparent in its process and its outcome, and that this incident had made visible a larger pattern of concerns that the company was committed to addressing systematically, immediately, and with accountability to the people it served. It said that a comprehensive review of training complaint procedures and service protocols would begin within 30 days. It said that an independent review board, including community members and equity advocates, would be formed to oversee the process and report publicly on its findings. It said that Naomi Richardson would hold a press conference the following morning at 9 o'clock and that she would take questions. It did not say everything. It was not meant to say everything. It was meant to be the first true thing, and it was. The response was immediate and enormous and moved in several directions at once. There were people who praised it, and people who called it insufficient, and people who called it overreach, and people who said it was about time, and people who said it was strategic, and people who said it didn't matter what was strategic. The only thing that mattered was whether it was real. Naomi read none of this. She was sitting in the dark in the hotel room in the chair next to the bed where Elijah was asleep, and she was holding the folded napkin with the lopsided plane drawing on it, and she was thinking about her mother, and she was thinking about the conversation she was going to have tomorrow in front of cameras, and she was thinking about Rebecca Hartley. Rebecca, she had learned from Greta at 5 o'clock, had gone home. She had finished her shift that had been Naomi's condition, and Marcus had honored it, and she had gathered her things from the crew locker room under the quiet watch of colleagues who were not sure what to say, and she had walked to the employee lot and gotten into her car and driven home to wherever home was. Naomi did not know what Rebecca was doing right now. She did not know if she was sitting with her daughter or on her couch watching news coverage that included video of herself, or staring at the ceiling, or calling someone who loved her and trying to explain what the day had been. She knew only that Rebecca was carrying something tonight that she had not carried this morning, and that whatever it was real. And that real things, the kind that don't have a clean name, the kind that sit at the intersection of dread and grief and the beginning of understanding, those were the things that had the possibility of changing people. Not certainly, not automatically, but possibly. She thought about what she had told Elijah on the plane. I think she might look at it. Eventually. She still believed that. She wanted to believe it. She folded the napkin one more time and set it on the nightstand next to Elijah's water glass and his phone, which had 3 text messages on it from a classmate named Jordan, who had apparently seen the video and had opinions. Elijah had read them and responded before falling asleep, and had shown his mother the exchange, which consisted primarily of Jordan saying, "Dude," and Elijah saying, "I know," and Jordan saying, "Your mom is scary," and Elijah saying, in what she thought was perhaps the truest thing said about her all day, "She's not scary, she just means it." She looked at her sleeping son. She had raised him to be curious and honest and patient and present, to treat strangers with the assumption of their dignity, to ask questions when something didn't make sense, to understand that fairness was not given but constructed, and that the construction required participation from everyone who wanted to live in it. She had not expected to have to watch him apply all of that at age 8 in a window seat at 32,000 feet. But then she thought maybe she had always known it would happen somewhere. She had just hoped it would be later. She had hoped he would have more time before the world required that of him. He hadn't had more time. The world had required it of him today. And he had been in every measure that mattered exactly who she had raised him to be. Her phone buzzed one more time. She looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, and it said, "Only, I watched it happen. And I didn't say anything. And I've been thinking about that all day. I'm sorry." She did not know who it was from. She didn't respond. But she read it twice. And she thought about all the people on that plane who had watched and said nothing, and whether tonight they were sitting with the same weight this stranger was carrying, and whether that weight was also in its own way a kind of beginning. She put the phone down. She leaned her head back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room and listened to her son breathe. And outside the window, the city of Chicago was doing what cities do, moving and loud and completely indifferent to any one story happening inside any one room. And tomorrow morning, she was going to walk out in front of cameras and say things that would be clipped and quoted and argued about, and the day after that, there would be more things, and the day after that, more still, and the process would be long and imperfect and contested, because everything real was long and imperfect and contested. But tonight, she was in a chair next to her son, and he was safe, and the napkin with the lopsided plane was on the nightstand, and she had meant every word she'd said today, every single word, which was the only way she knew how to move through the world. She closed her eyes. She tried, and her body refused the way it always refused when her mind was running too many processes at once. So she moved to the edge of the bed and sat there in the dark and listened to Elijah breathe and thought about 9 o'clock in the morning, which was the press conference, which was the next thing, which was the thing she had to walk through before she could see what was on the other side of it. She had given press statements before. She had stood in front of cameras at product launches and earnings calls, and once at a gate podium during a weather crisis when 300 stranded passengers needed someone with authority to look them in the eye and tell them the truth. She knew how to hold still under a camera. She knew how to choose words that were honest and precise and that did not give away more than the moment required. This was different. This was not a product launch. This was her son's face on 2 million screens and her own voice on those same screens saying his name like a declaration, and a flight attendant sitting somewhere in this city carrying something she hadn't carried yesterday morning, and a video that had cracked something open that a lot of people had been waiting a long time to see cracked open. This was the moment after the crack which was always the most consequential moment, not the breaking, but what you did in the space the breaking made. She showered at 5:30 and dressed by 6 and ordered coffee from room service and sat at the desk with her laptop and went through the notes she had made the night before about what she was going to say. Thomas had sent a revised draft of talking points. She read them, kept 2 sentences, rewrote the rest. At 6:45, she heard Elijah stir. He came padding out of the bedroom in his socks, hair sideways from sleep, blinking in the lamplight, and he said, "Why are you already dressed?" "Press conference at 9, she said. "I wanted time to think." He dropped into the chair across from her and pulled his knees to his chest and looked at her with the specific, focused attention that he deployed in situations he understood were serious. "Are you nervous?" She looked at her son. "A little," she said. He nodded like this was acceptable data. "What are you going to say?" "The truth," she said. He thought about this. "All of it. Enough of it," she said. "The part that matters most right now." "What's the part that matters most?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Chicago was already moving. She could hear it faintly through the window, the low register of a city that never fully stopped. "That what happened to you was wrong. That it wasn't an accident and it wasn't isolated, and that we know it and we're going to do something real about it, not something that looks like something. Something actual." He absorbed this. Then he said, "Can I come?" She had not planned on bringing him. She had imagined him staying at the hotel with Diane, insulated from the cameras and the journalists and the particular noise of a moment like this. She had wanted to protect him from the performance of the thing, even if he had lived through the substance of it. But he was looking at her with those steady, clear eyes, and she thought about what he had told Jordan. She's not scary, she just means it. And she thought about all the times she had told him that his presence in a room was not a burden, but a fact that he did not need permission to take up space, that belonging was not something earned, but something inherent. She thought about what it would mean for him to watch his mother walk into a room and say hard, true things out loud and not flinch. "Yes," she said, "you can come." He nodded like this was settled. "Okay, can we get pancakes first?" They got pancakes. Elijah ate his with an amount of syrup that Naomi noted and did not comment on because some battles were not worth fighting on the morning of a press conference. And he talked about Jordan, who had texted him 6 more times since last night, and about whether their class had seen the video, and about whether it would be weird at school when he got back. She told him it might be a little weird at first, and that weird wasn't the same as bad, and he said that was kind of what she always said about new things, and she said that was because it was usually true. He ate the last piece of his pancake and put his fork down and said without preamble, "Mom, what happens to the lady, the one on the plane?" Naomi set her coffee cup down carefully. She had been waiting for this question in the way that she waited for things she knew were coming, not with dread, but with the preparation of someone who believed in answering hard questions directly. "There's an investigation," she said. "She'll be interviewed. Everything will be reviewed. And at the end of that process, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "I don't know yet," she said, which was the honest answer. She knew the shape of what was likely. She did not know the exact form it would take because she had insisted on a process that was genuine rather than predetermined, which meant she had surrendered some control over the outcome in exchange for being able to look at the outcome and call it real. Elijah was quiet for a moment. "Do you want her to get fired?" The question landed with the clean, undeflectable precision that only children achieved, and Naomi sat with it for a full 10 seconds before she answered. "I want her to understand what she did," she said. "I want the company to understand how it allowed what she did. And I want every person who gets on a skyward flight from this point forward to be treated as if they belong there." She paused. "Whether or not she keeps her job is less important to me than whether any of that happens." Elijah thought about this with great seriousness. "That's a very long answer to a yes or no question," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand, though." "I think you do, too." They were in the car by 8:15, which gave them 40 minutes, which was enough. Diane was in the front seat coordinating with Thomas, who was already at the hotel ballroom that had been set up for the conference, and who texted at 8:22 to say that the room was at capacity, which meant journalists from 7 outlets and camera crews from 4, which was more than Thomas had anticipated when he'd sent out the notice the previous evening. Naomi read this and felt the familiar compression in her chest that preceded things that mattered. Not panic, not hesitation, the particular internal gathering of someone who was about to do something they had decided to do and had no intention of undoing. Elijah was watching Chicago go by outside the car window. He had his comic book in his lap, the one he'd bought at the airport in New York, the one he'd carried through all of it, and he wasn't reading it, just holding it the way you hold something familiar when unfamiliar things are happening around you. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "you don't have to do anything, you don't have to say anything, you just have to be there." "Is that enough?" he asked. "More than enough," she said. He looked back out the window. "Okay," he said, and then quietly, almost to himself, "I was already just there on the plane and it turned into all this." She almost smiled. "You're right," she said. "You were." The ballroom was louder than she expected, which was to say it was loud in the particular way of rooms where many people were trying to look like they were waiting calmly, while actually doing nothing calmly at all. Cameras were set, and reporters were checking their phones, and Thomas was standing near the door with the expression of a man who had been managing controlled chaos since approximately 6 in the morning and had found a sustainable rhythm with it. He pulled Naomi aside the moment she walked in. "Something happened," he said. She read his face. Thomas was not a man given to drama. If he was telling her something happened, something had happened. "Tell me," she said. "Rebecca Hartley," he said. "She submitted a written statement to HR this morning, 40 minutes ago. It came through Greta's office, and Greta called me immediately because of what it says." Naomi was very still. "What does it say?" Thomas looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him in their 3 years of working together. "She's not contesting anything," he said. "She's not defending the decision. She submitted a full written acknowledgement of the incident as documented, and she included—" He paused. "She included a personal statement addressed to Elijah." The noise of the room seemed to recede slightly. "Addressed to Elijah," Naomi repeated. "By name," she said. Thomas glanced at his phone, reading, not quoting from memory because he wanted to get it right. She said she had spent the night trying to find a policy reason or a procedural reason or any other reason for what she did, and she could not find one. She said the reason was one she was ashamed of, and that she was not the person she had believed herself to be, and that she was sorry in a way that she understood was insufficient, and that she wanted him to know, regardless of what happened in the investigation, that he had belonged in that seat completely, and that the failure was entirely her own. Naomi stood very still. She did not move for what felt like a long time. "Where is she now?" she asked. "At home," Thomas said. "She hasn't spoken to anyone publicly." Naomi thought about the text message she had received the night before from a number she didn't recognize. "I watched it happen, and I didn't say anything. And I've been thinking about that all day." She thought about the specific quality of Rebecca's face in that moment on the plane. Not the fear of exposure, but the beginning of something underneath the fear. Something that was looking at itself and not looking away. She thought about what she had told Elijah. I think she might look at it, eventually. She had not expected eventually to be overnight. But then real things moved on their own time, not the time you assigned them. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "I want to read that statement before I go out there." He handed her his phone. She read it standing in the corridor outside the ballroom with the noise of cameras and reporters seeping through the closed door, and she read it twice the way she read things when the first pass didn't fully land and the second pass was the one that got through. It was not eloquent, it was not polished. It had the rough, uneven quality of something written by a person at 4 in the morning who had decided to stop performing and simply say a thing that was true. The sentences were too long in some places and too short in others, and it did not read like a document prepared for an audience. It read like a letter written to a child by someone who knew the child would probably never see it, but needed to write it anyway, because not writing it was no longer possible. It was in its raw and unpolished way one of the most honest things Naomi had read in years. She handed the phone back to Thomas. "Keep this confidential for now," she said. This is between Rebecca and HR and Elijah is 8 years old, and his mother gets to decide when and how he receives it. Of course, Thomas said. And Thomas, this factors into the investigation as a cooperating statement, not as a mitigating one. The process still runs completely. Understood. She walked into the ballroom. The cameras swung toward her the moment the door opened, and the particular quality of attention in a room full of journalists shifted from ambient to focused. The way a lens shifts when something comes into range, and she walked to the podium that Thomas's team had set up, and she put her hands on either side of it and looked out at the room and took one breath. Elijah was standing to the left near the wall with Diane's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He was watching her. When she caught his eye, he gave her a small nod that was so precisely like the nods she had given him over the course of his life. I see you. I'm with you. You can do this. That she felt something move through her chest that she did not have time for right now and filed away for later. She began. She did not read from notes. She had never read from notes. She had internalized what she was going to say the way she internalized everything that mattered completely structurally, so that it lived in her and came out in her own cadence, rather than the cadence of a prepared document. She said that she was standing there not as a corporate representative managing a situation, but as a mother whose son had been asked to move from a seat he had paid for without reason, and that she was not going to pretend those two things were separable because they were not. She said that she had worked for Skyward Airlines for 11 years and loved the work and believed in the mission and was here today because she also believed that loving something meant being willing to hold it accountable. She said that the incident on Flight 447 was not an anomaly. She said that the data inside the company's own complaint records indicated a pattern, and that pattern was going to be addressed, not studied, addressed with a timeline and independent oversight and public reporting on progress. She said that the investigation into the specific incident was underway and that it would be transparent and that the outcome would reflect the actual findings and not a calculation of institutional convenience. She said that her son's name was Elijah and that he was 8 years old and that he had handled the morning on that plane with more grace and patience and intelligence than the situation deserved, and that she was not proud of that. In the way you are proud of something you planned, she was in awe of it, in the way you are in awe of something that exceeds what you thought was possible. She said that, out loud in a room full of cameras. She watched a journalist in the second row write something down very fast. Then she took questions. There were 14 of them over the course of 22 minutes, and she answered 12 and declined 2, both of which were questions about Rebecca Hartley. Specifically which she declined on the grounds that the investigation was ongoing, and that she was not going to participate in trying a specific person in a press conference when a formal process existed precisely to do this thing properly. The journalist who asked the second declined question pushed back. Can you at least characterize how you feel about the individual involved? She looked at him steadily. I feel that she is a human being in the middle of a reckoning, she said, and I think reckonings are hard. And I think what matters now is not how I feel about her individually, but what we do institutionally, and whether that does anything real for the people who have experienced this, not just on my airline, but on every airline, in every professional space, in every room where someone has been made to feel like they don't belong. The room was quiet for a moment. The journalist wrote something down. She stepped back from the podium at 9:34 and the room broke back into its ambient noise, and Elijah was there immediately at her elbow, looking up at her with those focused, serious eyes. You didn't read from anything, he said. No, she said. How did you know what to say? I knew what was true, she said, and I said that. He considered this. Is that always how it works? When you're lucky, she said. When you've had enough practice. He nodded. He looked at the room, the cameras being packed, the journalists talking into phones, the specific organized dispersal of a press event concluding. He took it in with the wide cataloging attention that was his baseline way of being in the world. And then he looked back at her and said, Mom, are things going to change? Actually change? She looked at her son. She thought about Bradford and James Whitmore and Thomas and Greta and the independent review board that didn't exist yet, but was going to exist. And she thought about the 30-day timeline she had committed to publicly, which meant she had committed to it permanently. And she thought about the 4,500 employees of Skyward Airlines who were going to be part of a training overhaul, whether or not every single one of them wanted to be. And she thought about all the things she could not control: the next incident, the next person who made a reflexive decision in an aisle and didn't understand what they were doing until they were looking at themselves on a screen, the slow and contested and imperfect process of institutional change, which was never clean and never fast and never the thing you imagined when you imagined it. She thought about Rebecca Hartley writing a letter at 4 a.m. to a child she didn't know. She thought about Carla Simmons pressing record and not stopping. She thought about a man in Seattle and a woman in Houston and a woman in Atlanta who had each found on a random Tuesday the courage to say out loud, "This happened to me too." She thought about Elijah at 32,000 feet watching clouds through a window saying, "I'm glad we sat in coach." She thought about her mother who had believed in planting things even when you could not see what would grow. "Yes," she said to her son, "some things will change, not all at once, not perfectly, but something real will be different because of what happened yesterday, and those differences will matter to real people. And that's not nothing." She paused. "That's actually everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay." And the okay was not the okay of a child being reassured. It was the okay of someone who had weighed something and found it satisfactory. It was the okay of someone deciding to believe in a thing, not because the evidence was complete, but because the evidence was enough. She took his hand. They walked out of the ballroom. The investigation concluded 17 days later. Rebecca Hartley was terminated from Skyward Airlines for conduct inconsistent with the company's service and equity standards. The termination letter, which Naomi reviewed before it was sent, included language acknowledging Rebecca's voluntary written statement and the honesty it contained, and it did not pretend that honesty changed the outcome, because honesty does not always change outcomes. But it was noted on the record, which was the most the process could offer. Rebecca did not contest the termination. Her union rep filed the mandatory review request, and then Rebecca withdrew it. She called Phyllis to say that she was withdrawing it, and Phyllis had said that was her right and that she respected it, and Rebecca had said that she didn't think fighting it was the right thing to do, which was the first time in Phyllis's 20 years of union representation that she had heard a flight attendant say those words about their own termination and mean them completely. The independent review board was constituted in 26 days, one outside the 30-day commitment which Thomas noted in the public update and which Naomi told him to note accurately. She had said 30 days, and it had taken 31, and people who were paying attention would notice, and she wanted them to see that she noticed too. The board included 4 community members, 2 equity advocates, a former transportation regulator, and a retired federal judge who had spent 12 years on civil rights cases and had agreed to chair the board after reading Naomi's statement and calling her office directly. Skyward's new service training protocol rolled out in 40 days. It was mandatory for all customer-facing staff, including senior crew. It was not a video. It was a structured, not a checklist. It was a structured program developed in partnership with the board that required crew members to sit with the discomfort of specific scenarios and talk about them out loud, because Naomi had insisted that the training do what training almost never did, which was acknowledge that the hardest thing to change is not what people know, but what they assume without knowing they're assuming. Carla Simmons taught her regular classes on the Monday after it all happened, and her students had seen the video, and she had spent the first 15 minutes of the day answering questions about it. And then she had said, "We're going to spend the rest of this period talking about what it means to witness something and what you do about it." And that conversation had run over into the next period, and then the one after that, and the English teacher in the room next door had knocked on the door at some point and asked if he could bring his class in, and Carla had said yes, and 47 students had spent an afternoon talking about a video of a boy in a window seat and what it meant that they had all watched it and felt something, and what feeling something was supposed to make you do next. She wrote about it afterward on the community forum where she had first posted the video. She wrote that she still didn't know if she'd done the right thing. She wrote that she knew it had needed to be done, which she understood was not exactly the same thing. She wrote that she had been a teacher for 23 years because she believed in paying attention, and that paying attention was only useful if it led somewhere, and that she was still figuring out where it led. The post got more comments than the video. Elijah went back to school on Wednesday. Jordan was waiting for him by the front entrance and said immediately, "No preamble. Your mom is the most intense person I've ever seen in a video." And Elijah had said, "She's even more intense in person." And Jordan had said, "That's genuinely terrifying." And Elijah had said, "Not really. You just have to know what you did wrong." And Jordan had gone very quiet for a moment and then said, "Yeah, okay." And they had walked into school together the way they always did. His teacher had not made a production of it. She had greeted him the way she greeted everyone directly, and without theatrical warmth, which was what he needed. He was not a story. He was a student who had been somewhere and come back and had math homework to turn in and a book report due Friday. He turned in the math homework. The book report was slightly late, which the teacher docked a grade for, and did not apologize for docking. He did not expect her to. Naomi found out about the grade on Friday evening, and she said, "Were you going to tell me?" And he said, "It was only half a letter grade." And she said, "Next time." And he said, "Yeah." And that was the whole conversation. And it was, she thought, a completely normal conversation about a completely ordinary thing, which was exactly what she had wanted for him on the other side of all of this. She framed the napkin. She did it herself at a frame shop near their apartment in New York, and she chose a simple dark frame and had the napkin mounted on a light background, and she hung it in her office, not at the company's headquarters, but in the small home office where she did the thinking that hadn't yet become decisions, where she kept the things that mattered in ways that didn't fit into organizational charts or strategic plans. The lopsided plane, the impossible colors on the skyline he had colored at the hotel, the small printing, "This is us." She looked at it every morning before the rest of the day began. Elijah saw it on a Sunday afternoon and said, "You actually framed it with the particular combination of pride and embarrassment that she had come to identify as one of her favorite emotions to witness." And she said, "Of course I did." And he said, "It's not even a good drawing." And she said, "It's the best drawing I own." And he rolled his eyes and went back to whatever he had been doing, and she looked at the framed napkin and thought that this was exactly what she had meant when she had told him that some things would change. Not everything. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But the morning they had lived through together, the small, confused hands, and the precise questions, and the name said out loud like a declaration, and the city colored in impossible colors, and the pizza, and the pancakes, and the press conference, and the 47 students talking about what it meant to witness something, all of that was real, and it had moved through the world. And the world was not exactly the same shape it had been before. That was not nothing. A boy had sat in a window seat because he had a ticket, and it was his seat. And when someone tried to tell him otherwise, his mother had stood up and said his name out loud. And the name had been enough. Not because of whose son he was, but because of who he was, a child, who belonged exactly where he was, which was everywhere, which had always been true, which was the only thing that had ever needed saying. And now it had been said, and it would not unsay itself.